Hey guys, welcome to this session by Intellipaat. So in this session, we're going to comprehensively learn about the Jfrog Artifactory. So before moving on to this session, please subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our upcoming videos, and also leave a like if you enjoy our content. Now let's take a quick glance at the agenda. So we'll start off by understanding what is an artifact, and then we'll understand what exactly is an artifact repository. Once we establish that, we'll start off with what is Jfrog Artifactory, and then look into the use cases of Jfrog Artifactory. Once we learn the theoretical concepts, we'll move on to the installation of Jfrog Artifactory, and once we completed it, we'll do an hands-on using it. And that would be the agenda for this particular session. Now, without any further delays, let's begin with it.
Now let's get started. What is an artifact and what is an artifact repository?
The files that contain both the compiled code and the resources that are used to compile them are known as artifacts. Basically, whenever a developer writes his source code, he gives it to a build tool so that the build tool can compile that source code into binary code. This is because whenever a developer writes source code, he writes it in the language that humans can understand, a human language. But machines can't understand that language. To make it understandable for machines, the build tool compiles it so that it's converted into a binary code, that is ones and zeros, that can be easily understood by machines. When these binary codes are taken together with the dependencies and resources that are required to run it and put together into one file or packaged into one file, that one file is known as an artifact. Basically, these are readily deployable files, like an executable. In Java, an artifact would be a .jar file, or a .var file, or a .ear file. .jar files are basic Java applications, and .var files are for web applications, and .ear files are for enterprise applications that can be contained in EGB containers. In NPM, the artifact file would be a .tar.gz file, and in .NET, the artifact file would be a .dll file.
Now let's go ahead and understand what an artifact repository is. What is an artifact repository? An artifact repository is a repository which can store multiple different versions of artifacts. Each time the war file or the tar.gz file is created, it is stored in a server dedicated for the artifacts. Now, how we normally go ahead with software development is that we write the source code and then we compile it, and then the code is tested and then reviewed. And then if successful, then the code is sent for deployment. But with the agile tech in use, there'll be a lot of different builds being made every day, even within a single team. And each time we change the code, we need to compile the code and then deploy the build in the server. But there might be a scenario where the testing team or the QA team will find an error in the code, and now there would be a need for a rollback. For this rollback to happen, we would have to go back to our Git or whichever VCS we were using, and then remove the first commit and go back to the previous commit, because we wouldn't be sure of what kind of error there might be in the latest version. So we need to go back to the previous version and deploy that one again. Instead of doing all that, what we could have done is we could have stored our artifacts in a repository, and we could have deployed the latest version using that artifact of the latest code. And if there was any error, we could roll back easily by just going back to the repository and deploying the artifact that was previously used. For example, here, if you see that there's an artifact version 1 and that has been stored inside the artifact repository, and then it goes for deployment. And then artifact 2 is stored in the artifact repository, and then it goes for deployment. And same with artifact 3, which also goes for deployment. Now, I suppose there was a need for a rollback because artifact version 3 has some error in it that can't be identified at the moment. But the customers still need to use the app, the application that is being used. So for that purpose, what we can do is, instead of going back to our source code in our version control system and going back to the previous commit, what we can do here is we can go back to the artifact repository and just use version 2 instead of version 3. So we could use artifact version 2 and then go ahead and deploy it. It's as easy as that, just going to our repository and selecting the previous version, so that the customer is still satisfied and we can look for errors in our new version 3. Sources versus binaries. Now let's understand the difference between source codes and binary codes. Source codes are stored as text, whereas binaries are stored as blob files. Source codes are diffable, whereas binaries are not diffable. What this means is that we can compare two different source codes as they're stored as text form, whereas we cannot compare two binary codes. Source codes are versioned by content and binary codes are versioned by name. Since we can compare the different source code, we can version them based on their content. But this is not possible in binaries, and therefore binaries are versioned by their name. Source codes are stored by override, but binaries are not stored through override. So what this basically means is that while using source code, when there is a need for an update, the current file is updated by replacing the previous file. Whereas in binary, while binary code is being used, the current file will never be rewritten. All the files are stored together. So when there is a need for an update, the current binary code will be pulled and the latest one will be pushed. Now that we have understood what an artifact is, what an artifact repository is, and the difference between source code and binary code, we can finally go ahead and learn what Jfrog Artifactory actually does and what it is. Jfrog Artifactory is a tool used in DevOps methodology for multiple purposes. One of its main purposes is to store artifacts that have been created in the code pipeline. Another one of its purposes is to act as a sort of a buffer for downloading dependencies for build tools and languages. So what basically Jfrog does is it acts as a Google Drive for our artifacts. We can store whichever artifact we want in that and then pull whichever we want. Now Jfrog can be easily integrated in a code pipeline. As you can see here, what happens is first, the version control will give the source code, the latest source code, to the build tool, and the build tool will build it and then produce a resulting artifact, which will then be stored in Jfrog Artifactory. And if deemed worthy, then Jfrog will send it to the deployment. This is all done with the help of the continuous integration tool, which could be your Jenkins, TeamCity, Bamboo, Excel Deploy, which is software tool you are using for continuous integration. Now the first thing Jfrog helps in is that it helps in storing readily deployable code. So basically whichever artifact we create or whichever artifact is the result of the latest source code that has been compiled will be stored in the Jfrog Artifactory. So like how we talked about an artifact repository, this is the same function that Jfrog Artifactory performs. The first artifact version will be stored in Jfrog, which will then send for deployment. Then the second one will be stored and that will be sent for deployment. And the third one will be stored, which also would be sent for deployment. And suppose there's a need for rollback because there's an error in version 3 that causes the application to crash, then we can pull back version 3 and then go ahead and deploy our version 2 again. It's a simple process of just selecting it. So this is one of the first responsibilities of Jfrog, that is to store all the artifacts, which can then go ahead for deployment. And the second responsibility of Jfrog is to help in downloading and managing dependencies. Since Jfrog will be connected to the build tool, what happens is that whenever a build tool requires a dependency based on the source code, usually the build tool will download the dependencies. But in this case, Jfrog acts as a buffer or a proxy for downloading and managing these dependencies. So if a build tool asks for dependency to Jfrog will get the dependency from a remote repository and then will store it in a local server, which will be then used by the build tool to build the source code. So those are the two responsibilities of Jfrog. First, it helps in managing and storing artifacts, and the second responsibility is it acts as a buffer for build tools to download and manage dependencies. Now that we've learned what Jfrog Artifactory is, why should we use Jfrog for DevOps? So the first quality that sets Jfrog on the stage for using in DevOps methodology is its high availability, system stability and reliability with Artifactory high availability. The binaries needed are always available on Jfrog once they are cached with it, and there is a certain assurance for their availability provided by the company. But the same can't be said about open source software, which doesn't provide the same assurance. So what basically high availability means is that whenever we are storing our artifact inside Jfrog, we have a certain assurance by the company that has created Jfrog Artifactory, that is Jfrog, that our artifacts will be available all the time. And since we would be paying them if you're using the Pro feature or the Pro version of Jfrog, then they absolutely have to give you the guarantee that all the artifacts that you need at the moment will be available through the repository. But the same can't be said with open case repositories, which do the same thing, because you can't ask them for an assurance for whether you will be able to pull the artifacts that you have stored in using their software at any time of point, because their website may crash or their servers may crash and you will not be able to pull it. And you can't even blame them for this because you're using their software for free. But since you're paying for the application, that is Jfrog Artifactory, you can have an assurance that is provided by the company that your artifacts will be available at all times. And if they aren't, then you can hold them responsible. Then the next quality is managing binaries across different environments. As the number of projects in a company grow, it becomes harder and harder to maintain the number of binaries each of them use. To avoid chaos, Jfrog manages environments and the binaries, which means is that if you have different teams working using different environments and storing different artifacts, there's a probability that there might be some chaos involved, that you might mix up some artifacts here and there. But Jfrog assures that this will not happen. It has the ability to store different artifacts for different projects, for different teams in different places, so that such a thing does not happen. The next quality is security, access control, and traceability. Since Jfrog works on caching assets important to the company, that is the source code of the software, it keeps the system secure and keeps track of metadata, like which person logged in at which time and what kind of changes or activity did they perform. Since a company's source code is its asset, it's its most important thing, it's important to keep it safe, and Jfrog helps in keeping your source code secure. It keeps track of metadata, like which person logged in at which time and what kind of activities and changes did they perform. Having such kind of metadata in storage means that if there is any sort of conflict in the future, then the party responsible for the conflict can be found out using this feature. Another quality is full support for Docker. Jfrog provides support for storing and distributing Docker images through its repository, which is simple enough in the terms that it means that you can easily store your images for Docker inside Jfrog, and then you can distribute it using Jfrog. So basically it has a seamless integration for Docker. Another quality is quickly replicating remote repos in local area. Jfrog is very efficient in replicating and storing remote repositories in short amount of time using check-based storage system. If one of the tools in your code pipeline wanted a remote repository for functioning, then you can easily ask Jfrog for it, and Jfrog can easily replicate that repository and store it in a local server for further or future use. It has support for Chef. Jfrog has comprehensive support for Chef. This allows for creation of targeted configuration scripts that make sure only permitted dependencies are used for particular projects or environments. Since Jfrog has a lot of support for Chef, it means that it will be easy to make targeted configuration scripts to make sure that only permitted dependencies are used for a particular project or an environment. That is use cases of Jfrog Artifactory. So there are many use cases, and let's see what are they. First, it's binary repository manager. As we have seen, it manages our binaries or artifacts. It's a place where you can store all your artifacts. So other than managing our binaries, it can also store all our artifacts. It's a proxy for remote repository, which means is that it acts as a proxy for getting those remote repositories. If a tool inside our code pipeline wanted to use a repository that is not inside the intranet of the company or of the team, then Jfrog can act as a proxy and get the remote repository for the tool. Dependency manager working again, which means is that your dependency manager, whichever one you're using, will work against it when you download a dependency and will ask Jfrog for the files, and when it does so, Jfrog will get those files from internet. It's a place where we can store all our Docker images so that anyone who's working within the code pipeline can easily pull those Docker images without actually having to go outside. Artifactory integration, which basically means is that it has support for integration with multiple DevOps tools. If you wanted to use some DevOps tools that are not standard, it also supports the integration with them. It provides a faster release and business continuity, which means that you can install Jfrog in multiple servers. It can be scalable. It has disaster recovery options and replication options, which are only available in the enterprise version, not in the open source version, since this is the feature that would be provided by the company. Orchestration tools. It provides support for different orchestration tools like Docker, Kubernetes, and Helm that can be easily integrated with Jfrog. And it is storage ready, which means that it has the ability to store data in multiple areas like S3 object storage, which is a typical web service that lets you store and retrieve data in an object store via an API reachable over HTTPS. The service offers unlimited storage space and stores your data in a highly available and durable way.
Okay guys, a quick info, if you're looking for an end-to-end training in DevOps, Intellipaat provides that, and you can check those details in the description box below. Now let's continue with this session.
Now that we've understood what an artifact is, an Artifactory repository, using that knowledge to understand what Jfrog Artifactory is and why do we need it in DevOps, and learning some of its use cases, we can go ahead and install our Jfrog Artifactory. So let's look at some of the prerequisites of it. So before installing Jfrog, we will need to have OpenJDK in our instance and have at least 2 GB of RAM, which means we'll have to use the marketplace CentOS. Now let's go ahead and create our CentOS. So we will go to our AWS console, click on launch instance and go to our AWS marketplace, type CentOS and then click on the first one that you get, CentOS 7. Continue. We will need to use tt.micro since it has the required amount of memory that we need, that is at least 4. Let's review and launch it, but before that let's add a inbound rule for all TCP anywhere. Review and launch. Use an existing key pair, click on I acknowledge and launch the instance. Your instance will be running now. View instance, name it appropriately. We will name this Jfrog Artifactory. Okay, now we'll wait for it to get initialized so we can copy our IP address and launch it using our putty tool. Paste the IP address here. Let's make it a little more visually appealing so you guys can see it properly. 180 seconds between authorization, and so we'll go ahead and put our key in, browse RAM key. Okay, open it, click on yes, login as CentOS. Okay, clear the screen and let's make it full screen. Our first prerequisite was OpenJDK, so let's install OpenJDK. Let's sudo su so we don't have to keep typing sudo. Clear. And the command for installing OpenJDK is yum install java 1.8.0 OpenJDK dev. Yes please. Yes. Okay, our Java is installed and we have an instance with space of at least 4 GB RAM. Okay, now let's go ahead and install Jfrog. Now we can go with 2 ways with this. We can directly install the tar.gz file, or we can use Docker to install it. Docker to pull the image and then launch it as a container. So for that, first we'll need to install Docker inside our CentOS instance. So for that, the commands are sudo yum install, yum utilis, device mapper persistent data, and lvm2. These are the packages that we'll need for Docker. And press enter. This will install the packages that we need for Docker. Okay, now that we've installed the packages, we can go ahead and set up a stable repository for Docker. So let's copy this command. This is the command we'll need, and come over here to instance, paste the command and press enter. It says that the repo has been saved. Okay, let's clear the screen and go ahead and install Docker. This is the command for installing Docker in CentOS 7. Go ahead, paste it, yum install docker c client container.io. Enter. Yes please. This will install Docker for us in our instance. Clear screen. Now that we've installed Docker, let's go ahead and start it. System ctl start Docker. This is the command to start Docker. Okay, let's make sure it's started. Systemctl status Docker. This should check the status of Docker. As we can see, Docker is active. So let's go ahead and clear the screen. And now that Docker is active, let's go and get the command for pulling Jfrog from the website. So go ahead to the browser, type Jfrog open source. This will take us to their open source website where we can download all the open source softwares. So we will click on Artifactory, and Artifactory OSS is the Artifactory open source software, and you'll have the option to pull the latest Artifactory Docker image. So if you click on it, if you copy the command and paste it to your clipboard, so you can come back here and paste that command. So the command will be docker pull docker.bintray.io jfrog artifactory OSS, and press this enter. This will start pulling the latest image for Jfrog Artifactory OSS and store it inside your instance. Now we're using Docker to pull an image and launch Jfrog Artifactory because it's much easier to do so rather than directly downloading it and installing it in your instance. Okay, now let's use the command docker images to check if the image has been downloaded. Yes, it's been downloaded. Okay, now that we've downloaded our Docker and downloaded the image for Jfrog, let's see what the next command is. The next command is to start Jfrog Artifactory, get the name of the image, pull, and run it as Docker container. So we'll be running a Docker container on the port 8081. Know the name. Docker images. Okay. So Docker run -it -t -p port number 8081 name artifactory and then the name of the image, and paste this name and then press enter. Now this has launched the container that has Artifactory in it. Clear the screen, docker ps to see which all containers are running, and we can see that the container is running at the port 8081 TCP. Alright, to access this we'll need to head to the browser and open another tab, copy the IP address, paste it, go to 8081, press enter, and this will start your Jfrog Artifactory. And with this, we have completed the installation of Jfrog. Now that we have installed Jfrog, we can go ahead and practice. Now let's see what are the steps we'll be taking during our practice session. So the first step is running Jfrog Artifactory and setting up the admin. That we've already done. And the second is using Git to get the sample code. And this is the sample code we'll be using to see how versioning works in Jfrog. And the third step is to install Maven to compile and package the sample code. And the fourth step is to connect Maven to Jfrog. And fifth is check how versioning works in Jfrog. Now let's go ahead and set up the admin. We'll go here, come over here, and we'll enter the password and username. The username is admin and the default password is password. Now this is a generic one. We can go ahead and create a proper user later, but this is just for practice. Okay, now that we're inside Jfrog, we can see that this is the dashboard, and before the dashboard there's a pop-up telling us welcome to Jfrog Artifactory. Click on next. It'll ask us to configure a proxy server, but we do not need to configure a proxy server right now as we're just practicing. But when do we need to configure a proxy server? We will need to do so in case we don't have access to internet from the current server or system that we're using. Suppose you're working inside a company and the only access you have is to intranet on your particular system or server. So that time you can always configure a proxy so that you can access internet through the proxy instead of directly accessing it. But let's go ahead and click on skip, and then it'll ask you to create repositories. So the repository we'll be creating today is the Maven repository, because Maven is the build tool that is used to build Java-based applications. So click on Maven and press create. So it has created 5 directories: libs snapshot local, libs release local, jcenter, libs snapshot, and libs release. So the libs release local will store the war file, the snapshot will store the snapshots of the versions, and the libs release will store the dependencies. I can go ahead and click on finish, and then it will show us the dashboard of Jfrog Artifactory. Now before we move on to our next steps, let's familiarize ourselves with Jfrog a little bit. So if you come up over here, it'll tell you welcome admin or welcome username. If you click on it, it will show you a quick setup. It will show you local repository. If you want to create a new local repository, you can create it from here, or you can go ahead and create a remote repository using whichever package you want. And you can do a virtual repository, distribution repository. You can go ahead and do administrative tasks like add a user, in which you can add a user, or you can add a group, or you can add permissions to particular groups or users. Now these are the administrative tools, and this is for setting up repositories for storing your artifacts. Now if you want to see administration tools in more advanced situations or more advanced tools, you can go ahead and click over here. This will show you many more things to configure: general configure, proxies, mail, SSH server, security, services, import and export, and log analytics, system logs, system info, maintenance, and etc. And if we come back to our home, this will just be our home page, show basic things like quick search and the features of Jfrog, and etc. and show you the last deployed builds, most downloaded artifacts, and etc. Now you can click over here and it'll show you artifact repository browser, where it will show us all the directories that we have created for our Maven. Or if you want to search for an artifact in particular, you can come over here and click on this. You can search the artifact based on the criteria and filter by artifact. So now that we're familiarized with ourselves with Artifactory, we can go ahead and complete the next steps. That is to use Git to get the sample code, install Maven, connect Maven to Jfrog, and check how versioning works. So let's go to our instance. Okay, and let's go ahead and install Git in this. So we'll do yum install and Git, and let us also install wget. We'll be using that to get Maven. Okay, now we've installed Git and wget. Now let us get our sample code. So for that, we'll need to get the repository URL. For that, we'll need to go over here. You'll need this link, github.com, gkdevops, and pet clinic. This is where our sample code is located in GitHub. We'll go to our web browser, paste the link on the navigation, press enter, and this is our sample code with the pom.xml file. We can click on clone and download, copy the URL for the repository, come back to our instance, type in the commands git clone. This will clone in the pet clinic repository and paste the URL for it and click enter. Okay, now that we've cloned the sample project, let's go ahead and install Maven also. Clear the screen, go back to our browser, type Apache Maven. We'll go to the Maven website, click on download, and come down and get the latest version and copy the link address of the tar.gz file. This is the one we'll be using. Copy the link address, come back to your instance, use the wget command and paste the link and press enter. This would have downloaded your tar file for Apache Maven. Let's go untar it. So tar zxf apache maven bin.tar.gz. Now that we have untarred it, we can go inside Apache Maven, inside bin, and see if it's working or not. So for that, command is maven version. This will check which version it's using. So we'll see if Maven is installed properly or not. And this will show us Maven, Apache Maven 3.6.2. Great. Now we have a Maven installed and we can use Maven to compile and package our sample project. But before that, we will go ahead and make sure that Maven is available to all of the OS. So for that, we'll be using the command export, and we're using the environment variable path and setting it so that all of the OS $ will be able to use Maven, not just from this position. So the command would be export path equals $path :/opt Apache Maven wherever your Maven is stored, and then bin, and press enter. We'll come out of the Apache Maven folder, and now we will see if Maven is compiling our project or not. We'll type Maven compile, and as you can see, it's downloading the repositories from the central server, but this is without the help of Jfrog Artifactory. Let's just quit. We just wanted to see if it's compiling it or not. We don't actually need it to compile. So we clear the screen, and now we need to connect our Maven with our Jfrog Artifactory. For that, let's head to the browser, and when you come to the browser, make sure you're in the dashboard, and in the dashboard, go ahead and click on lib snapshot local. Now after you click on that, click on Maven generate settings. But before you click on Maven generate settings, you need to enter your password. This is how it will be for you. And enter the password you use to enter Jfrog. Okay, after you've entered the credentials, go ahead and click on generate Maven settings and set up and leave the default configurations be and come down and click on generate settings. And this is the XML file that it will create for you. Now this is the file we will need to connect our Maven to Jfrog. So let's go ahead and copy that. Or instead of doing that, we can go ahead and download the snippet and check it out in the folder, open it up with Notepad and just Control A, Control copy. Now we have the settings, we can come back to our instance. So the place where we need to enter these details is inside the root folder. And now that we've had, let's see which all folders are there inside. We'll do ls-a because this will show all the folder, even the hidden folder. And the folder we need to go inside is .m2, which is a hidden folder. So now we see that .m2 inside root folder. We'll go inside it. So cd .m2. Now we're inside .m2 folder. Now we will open the file settings.xml. Okay, since it's a new file, we'll go ahead and paste whatever content we copied from here. Okay, as you can see, we've pasted the content, and what this basically means is that Maven will be asking Jfrog for the dependencies anytime it wants any dependencies. So anytime a dependency needs to be downloaded, it will be done through Jfrog. And this will also connect Maven with Jfrog. So the only updates we need to make over here are under username and password. Just enter the username and password that you used to get inside. That is admin and password. Now let's enter Maven compile. And now that we've made the settings, we can go ahead and try Maven compile again. And if we try Maven compile this time, we can see that it is getting the dependency using Jfrog. We'll wait for it to get compiled, then I'll show it to you guys. As you can see, it's using Artifactory. It's not using Maven as for getting the dependencies. It's using Artifactory to get the dependencies. So now that we've connected Maven with our Artifactory, this will happen every time that Maven builds a project. Every time Maven builds a project, it will ask those dependencies that it scanned from the pom.xml file to the Jfrog Artifactory, and Jfrog Artifactory will go and get those dependencies and download them into the local server so that Maven can use those repositories to build the file. As you can see now that our Maven has been compiled our project, and we can go forward and set up the distribution system. Now to set up the distribution system, we go back to our browser and come to our Jfrog dashboard. Now click on libs snapshot local again, and we'll come down and we'll copy this part of the code. It will be used to deploy the war file or the jar file, whichever artifact you have created, onto the Jfrog Artifactory. So let's come back to our instance, let's clear the screen, and we need to paste this code inside our pom.xml file. Come down. Okay, we need to paste this code after the dependencies are over. So we'll need to keep going down. A lot down. Okay, so as we can see, this is the closing tag for the dependencies. We have to paste it after this tag. And now we will type the command maven deploy. This will upload the packaged file onto Jfrog. Press enter. And now that our build is successful, to see whether the file was uploaded or not, we'll head over to the go to Jfrog, click on the Artifactory browser, home, Artifactory repository browser, and in that, under libs snapshot local, if you click on it, you can see the artifact count. If it shows you, you can see how now there is 4 MB of 40 MB in artifact count. Now if you click on lib snapshot, if you open it, you can see that there is a folder created there. That is org spring framework samples spring pet clinic. And if you will open 4.2.5 snapshot, you can see that we have our executable over here. That is the war file. So with this, we know that Jfrog can store artifacts that are connected with Maven and that have been deployed using Maven or any other build tool. We just use Maven in our case. If you see JCenter is where all the third-party dependencies will be stored. As you can see, this is where all the third-party dependencies are stored. Now that we've seen that Jfrog can store artifact, let's see how the versioning works in Jfrog. So let's come back to our instance, clear the screen. To simulate a change in the code, what we'll do is we'll go inside our pom.xml file and we will go and change the version We will change the version from 4.2.5 to 4.2.6. And we will go ahead and write and save it. And we'll type mv deploy again. Press enter. And we can see that Maven is compiling the project again, running the test cases, compiling all the resources and all the binary code into one WAR file, and then uploading it to the Jfrog. But the only difference here being that we've changed the version from 4.2.5 to 4.2.6. And that change should reflect on our Jfrog in the browser. Okay, now let's go and check it in our browser. Now click on lib snapshot again, open it, and open the org file. And now you can see that there's a 4.2.6 snapshot. So we have simulated a change, and now we can see that it stores the artifacts for different versions. This is for 4.2.6 Lua file, and this is for 4.2.5. Now suppose if we had an error in this application and we couldn't figure it out, or if we wanted to do a rollback, we can just easily come over here and use this file. As easy as that. No need to go back and change the commits and everything. So we've seen how Jfrog works in combination with Maven, building a Java file and uploading the artifact. But Jfrog can work with a lot of other build tools also. If you come and see here, if you keep on going to the side, you can see that it works with NuGet or npm or PHP Composer or Bower and etc. So basically what we learned today in the video was that Jfrog is an artifact repository, that it manages all the artifacts that have been uploaded to it, and it can have an easy rollback. And the second thing that Jfrog does is it manages and downloads dependencies for your build tool. So guys, that's it for today.
Okay guys, a quick info, if you're looking for an end-to-end training in DevOps, Intellipaat provides that, and you can check those details in the description box below. Okay guys, that's it for this session. I hope you understood and also it was helpful and informative. If you have any queries, leave a comment down below and we'll love to help you out. Thank you.